Hello, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon called Extending the Growing Season, Season Extension Activities in Kansas. My name is Ashley Jones-Weisner, and I am State Policy Director at kchealthykids. And Mary Merrow, who is a Senior Staff Attorney for the Public Health Law Center, will also be helping me moderate today's session. I wanted to begin really briefly by just going over the goals for today's webinar. There are four. The first is to describe season extension activities that can be used in Kansas and the benefits to local communities. The second is to identify policy and legal issues impacting season extension activities. The third is to discuss opportunities to work with policymakers to develop and implement successful season extension activities. And the last is to explore the role that season extension activities can play in supporting healthy food initiatives in urban and rural settings in Kansas. We have a fantastic lineup of presenters for you today, and I will just briefly provide you with some of their bio information. The first presenter today will be Tom Bowler. Tom is a horticulture extension agent with K-State Research and Extension, Douglas County. He's been a commercial organic vegetable and fruit producer since 2006, and he's worked to build the local food system in and around Lawrence for many years, and is a founding member of Fresh Farm HQ, a farmer-owned cooperative food hub serving Kansas City and Lawrence that many of you might have heard about. Our second presenter today is Amanda Carls, who is a staff attorney with the Public Health Law Center. In addition to her work at the Public Health Law Center, she has served as an appointed commissioner on the St. Paul Ramsey County Food and Nutrition Commission. She's a community elected member of her local planning council, and she also volunteers with state-level policy advocacy groups to promote equitable access to healthy food. Prior to joining the Public Health Law Center, her legal career included private practice and legal public affairs. She also has food systems experience, including small business entrepreneurship, culinary education programming, and natural foods marketing. And our final panelist today will be Helen Schnoes. She is the Food Systems Coordinator for Douglas County, Kansas. In her role, she serves as staff support to the Douglas County Food Policy Council, which is a joint advisory board and the oldest such group in Kansas. Helen's work to build strong, healthy local food systems has ranged from supporting public input and awareness concerning urban agriculture policy changes to overseeing a county-wide food system plan, which will be adopted this summer. Helen holds a master's in regional planning from Cornell University. So as I mentioned, I'm State Policy Director for kchealthykids, and I thought it might be helpful to provide a little bit of a background on this resource and kchealthykids' work on these topics. So when we first looked at issues in terms of access to healthy food in Kansas, we know that there are policies that impact accessibility. kchealthykids, in partnership with the Public Health Law Center, has been working to build tools to help inform Kansans and assist them in navigating through local policies with the goal of increasing accessibility to healthy food. Several years ago, we published a farmer's market guide, which is on the slide that you can see right now. And the farmer's market guide has served, the goal of that guide was to serve as a way for individuals or organizations wanting to start farmers markets in their respective cities and counties, for them to serve as a tool to help guide them through that process. So that guide was actually a 5-part toolkit and looked at everything from planning and zoning, permitting, and board development or governance needs that one would likely need if they wanted to think through how they might start a market or how they might strengthen an existing one. As an example, we knew from our work in Wyandotte County that farmers markets in Wyandotte County were classified as retail, the same way CVS or Walgreens or another small store might be, or large store for that matter, and beholden to the same planning, zoning, permitting rules as those stores. So this guide would help not only those cities and counties to navigate through those planning and zoning processes, but would also serve as a document that would provide guidance for best practices should a community want to pursue changing policy to increase access to healthy food. So a natural next step to build on that resource was to look at season extension. We know that one of the barriers for purchasing of local foods at both the small and large scale throughout our state is the limited growing season here in Kansas. As we all well know, the best time for produce is typically the summer when institutions like schools aren't in session. season extension structures can help overcome those barriers. And we have a really great group of panelists this afternoon, as I said, that will help us to dig into this more, pun intended. With that, I would like to turn it over to Tom Bowler to provide us with a general overview of season extension. Tom?
Hi. So I'm Tom Bowler. I'm a horticulture agent with K-State Research and Extension, Douglas County. And I just want to provide a brief introduction into season extension, talking about it pretty broadly. And then I'd be happy to answer more specific questions in the question and answer period when it comes to that. I want to start off with this picture. This was actually taken on December 18th last year. You can see snow in the ground on the background, and that lettuce had been harvested by one of my neighbors the day before that. On December 18th, we reached an overnight low of -15 here in Lawrence, Kansas, and I think the daytime high was about 5 degrees. I thought it was really nice to have fresh, locally grown lettuce, so I went outside to take a picture, or have my son take a picture, and we were out there for about 2 minutes, and the lettuce froze while we were out there. So I got a neat picture of lettuce harvested in the middle of winter, or in early winter, I guess, and I thought that was a nice way to start the season extension, because that's really what it's all about, being able to grow crops at times when maybe you wouldn't normally grow them in that area. So I'll talk a little bit about season extension very broadly. As its name implies, it's about growing crops outside of the season they're normally grown. And the term, I guess, is really commonly used, but it's a little bit of a misnomer. Sometimes the idea is also called protected agriculture, because there are really a lot of benefits and possibilities beyond just growing crops outside of their sort of normal season. And the techniques that you can use to extend growing seasons span everything from choosing, either heat-tolerant or cold-tolerant cultivars of whatever vegetable you're trying to grow, all the way up to managing heat in greenhouses with sort of really massive environmental modification, and everything in between. I'm going to talk probably mostly about the season extension structures, because often when we talk about legal barriers or things that communities can do, those structures are really where a lot of the focus develops. But I will provide a little bit of background. So I mentioned cultivar selection is one technique that can be used for season extension. Another one that's really common on sort of small to medium scale fruit and vegetable production is the use of plastic mulch. So here are some broccoli plants and peppers, and then on the right side some tomatoes being grown under a black plastic mulch. Black plastic is a real basic season extension, because what it does is you lay it down several weeks or months before you want to plant the crop, and it heats the soil up faster than it would naturally. Like I said, season extension sometimes called protected agriculture, because it's not just about the seasons. The black plastic mulch also provides a way to control weeds without spraying or hoeing them, and also can control soil moisture better and conserve moisture. So it's not that all the benefits aren't just that you can grow something a little bit earlier, but it provides other benefits as well. As an example of that, this is actually on the same farm. This is Willette's Farm Fresh, just south of Lawrence, Kansas, and they grow strawberries. You can't see it here, but these strawberries are grown on those same black plastic beds that the peppers and broccoli were, and that allows them to get the crop out, start picking about 2 weeks earlier than they would if these were just grown in regular matted row production systems. So that can help get the crop earlier and provide a longer marketing window if they then also have other types of production or different varieties to spread the season. Another type of season extension here is pictured inside a high tunnel, but what I want to draw your attention to is the stuff on the ground. It's called floating row cover. Basically, you can use it outside too, and you can just lay it over the rows. It provides a little bit of insulation. It traps the ground's warmth, and keeps things from freezing. So this can usually add a couple weeks of season onto things outside and improve the quality of cold-tolerant crops when you start getting freezing temperatures. In addition, like I'm saying, a number of these techniques have a variety of benefits. This row cover also provides some pest protection because it will exclude pests from there. One thing in this picture that I'll come back to in a little bit, but I just want to point out while we're here, if you look on the right side there, this is a hoop house just outside of Lawrence, Kansas, and there is rosemary growing quite prolifically. Rosemary is a crop that isn't hardy at this climate zone usually, but with a high tunnel, you can keep it that way. So moving up sort of, I guess, what I'm considering the chain of management, we have what we call low tunnels, and on the right side there you see a low tunnel that has the same cloth that was laying on the ground, that floating row cover stretched over some hoops. The benefit of that is it keeps that cloth off of the tops of the plants. When you have the cloth just laying on top of the plants, if you get a colder temperature, I mean, that's good for right at frost temperatures, but if it gets a little bit colder than that, there will sometimes be condensation on the inside and it'll freeze to leaves. And if you're trying to grow something like a cut lettuce or something like that where the look and quality of the leaf is really important, that can degrade your crop. So keeping it up off of there is an important step. On the left side, you see some similar hoops just covered with some greenhouse plastic. These are usually used for early season warming, although sometimes people will do the same thing for some late season cover. The challenge with those in Kansas is that small area heats up pretty quickly on a sunny day, so you have to kind of actively manage the temperature inside that. Otherwise, you can actually cook your crops on even on cold days outside. So then moving up the next level here, this is a small urban high tunnel. This is actually taken in the city of Lawrence. The dimensions of this are about 12 feet by about 30 feet. The difference between a high tunnel and a low tunnel is, obviously a high tunnel is taller. The line that usually gets drawn is we call it a low tunnel if you can't walk in it, and a high tunnel if you can walk in it. That obviously makes a lot of difference if you want to do some extreme season extension. Harvesting lettuce in the winter isn't that fun if you have to pull back the cover and reach under there compared to being able to walk into something. Here you see some early transplants being grown and a number of different crops being grown in the ground here. And that kind of brings me to the next point. The difference between a high tunnel and a greenhouse is not a huge difference. So here's another, I guess you might call it urban. It's in a very small town. This is a high tunnel in Scandia, Kansas, just right in the middle of town there. And the difference generally being between a high tunnel and a greenhouse is kind of on the level of technical sophistication and what you're doing inside of it. So in greenhouses, things tend to be grown either on benches or if there's a gravel floor, maybe in grow bags or something like that, whereas in high tunnels, they're more frequently just grown in the soil, in the structure. And then also greenhouses have more equipment, so ventilation, you see there's a fan here, some opening vents, and they'll also usually have heaters. That's kind of the difference. There's no real hard and fast difference because the structures are pretty much identical. The way they're used is a little bit different because high tunnels tend to rely more on natural ventilation, and like I said, they get planted in the soil. Here are some more high tunnels. Also, this is CNC high tunnels again in Scandia, and I just like these because they're literally just right in town there. They bought 3 city lots and built these 3 high tunnels, and then they had another lot next to their house and put up that other one that I just showed you. And so they're just going to town growing things. Once you get into the realm of season extension, there's also lots of interesting possibilities. This is at Fish Gardens Aquaponics, which is near Eudora, Kansas. And this is Fred Trefts and Pam Staub. They grow lettuce aquaponically, which is different from hydroponics in that the nutrients in the solution are all from fish. So they have a system that yields 2 crops in their greenhouse here, one of them being lettuce, and the other one is they grow tilapia in there. So this isn't an urban example of a high tunnel, but it's certainly something that some people could do, and it's a very season extension technique. In this case, they kind of reverse the season the other way from the lettuce I was showing you, in that they grow lettuce in here year-round, including in the summer. So you can grow lettuce in the cold weather, but also in the summer, which outdoors in Kansas is pretty much a challenge. It's too hot and dry in July usually to have any sort of lettuce quality. But using some of the environmental modification techniques through season extension, it is possible to grow things outside of the growing window in both directions, I guess. Oh, wrong way. And so that kind of raises the question, and I'll talk about it in 2 different ways. Why should we extend the season? So this first slide here, I'm talking about it sort of from the grower's perspective, and then I'll talk about why communities should encourage that. So the first thing is, obviously, you get earlier production and later production of crops. So with tomatoes, which is probably the most commonly grown high tunnel crop in Kansas, you can get them between 4 and 6 weeks earlier than you would if you grew them outside. For people that are selling at market, having this early window is usually when the prices are the highest, so they're able to make more money for their crop. And then late season production too, so you can have things after frost might have killed them out in the field. And again, when not everyone else has them is usually when prices are good for the producer. There are other benefits, though, to season extension techniques that go just beyond the sort of obvious, like it extends the season. So one of them is that it dramatically improves the quality of produce. This is actually something that Eleni Pliaconi is doing research on here at K-State, studying the I guess, biological value of high tunnels, and they've shown that just growing a crop in a high tunnel, it will have a longer shelf life than the same crop grown basically in the same conditions outside, and not the same conditions, but same temperatures and all of those things. The difference being the high tunnel controls some of the splashing that happens on the crop and things like that, so they last longer. And then you also get that market advantage, like I talked about with the pricing. Another thing that happens with customers at farmers markets especially is if you're the first person with tomatoes, they'll start buying tomatoes from you, and then once everybody else at market has tomatoes, those customers will keep coming to your stand because they're accustomed to you. And so that provides a real market advantage for growers that use that. So that's, kind of the short reasons of why farmers should use high tunnels, or people interested in growing things should use high tunnel. But the question then is, why should we encourage that? And that's kind of what the gist of today's talk is about. And from the first thing I'd like to say, people are always interested in money, and season extension can have some real economic benefits. So here's a small greenhouse in the KC metro area. It's City Bitty Farms, and they've got attached to this garage, there's they've added more since, but there was a high tunnel that was about 30 by 48, and a couple of years ago they did about $130,000 worth of vegetable production out of that high tunnel in a year. So that's a really successful small business that's basically just in an urban neighborhood. Here's Chris and Christy Jansen of CNC High Tunnels, who I showed you pictures of their operations earlier. The reason I have them here under economic benefits is the way they got started in their business was that Chris basically got downsized by the company he was working for. Being in a very small town, there weren't a lot of other options, so they decided to make their own options and started this high tunnel business that's now their income. So it's an opportunity for entrepreneurs to start businesses. And then in addition to that sort of economic benefit, there's the other social benefit that it expands the availability of local foods. So high tunnels can bring us things outside of the season. And as Ashley mentioned earlier, one of the challenges in Kansas with getting people to eat more locally grown foods is people are accustomed to everything being available all the time. Well, high tunnels can't do that. Season extension can't do that, but they get us a little bit closer to having longer windows of the products that people are accustomed to eating being available from local growers. And that kind of wraps up my part, so I'll now hand it over to Amanda to talk a little bit about the legal and policy issues.
Well, thanks, Tom. That was fantastic, and I definitely learned a lot. As Ashley mentioned, I'm a staff attorney at the Public Health Law Center, and at the Public Health Law Center, we use the power of law to help create communities where everyone can be healthy. That's why I'm really excited to be talking to you about legal issues around season extension activities in Kansas communities. As Helen Schnoes is going to discuss in a few minutes, there are many good reasons to support season extension activities, and Tom actually has already gone over some of them as well. But as you're going to see, there are some issues, including local zoning and other regulatory impediments that can sometimes stand in the way of season extension activities, and for purposes of today's presentation, I'm going to refer to them as SEAs. Especially where structures like greenhouses and hoop houses are built to support SEAs in urban settings. Oftentimes these regulations were created without consideration of the benefits of SEAs and were instead reactionary measures introduced during the industrialization of America in the early 20th century. An unintended consequence of these policies was that people became increasingly disconnected from their food and reliant on food sources from outside of their own communities. Fortunately, in recent years, many local governments have not only begun to evaluate how their local regulations may be unnecessarily restricting options for growing food throughout their communities, but to actually begin using their general regulatory and land use powers to support health and equity in their communities. This is a positive development for food security and health, as local governments typically have more flexibility to be innovative than larger state and federal governments, and they're often better equipped to make decisions that reflect the needs of their individual communities. So here at the Public Health Law Center, we can assist communities as they are evaluating policy issues and opportunities for SEAs. Among other things, we can provide legal research and policy development expertise, as well as to develop publications, trainings, and presentations like the one we are doing today. Please know that the information that we're covering today is very cursory in nature. There are a lot of laws and regulations affecting SEAs in Kansas and elsewhere, which is why we are also producing a forthcoming season extension guide for your communities. Although we do not provide direct legal representation, and the information in that guide in today's presentation should not substitute for legal counsel, it's our hope that the resource and this presentation will help to point you in the right direction. Okay, so for today, first I want to cover what some of the regulatory issues that SEA gardeners and farmers may encounter so that you can have a feel for what the legal landscape is likely to be in your community. And then I will get into some of the options you have for working with local planning officials and policymakers to ensure that SEAs are allowed and supported in your communities. To get started, we'll be covering zoning regulations and construction codes, nuisance claims and anti-nuisance laws, and we'll get into a little bit around utility regulations. So with that in mind, let's look at zoning regulations. Zoning regulations control how property can be used. They can help establish and protect SEAs, but unfortunately they also have the potential to discourage them if implemented without careful assessment of their potential impact. In Kansas, you're going to want to look at your local city or county to determine what zoning regulations apply to your property. This is an important step before making any changes to your land. If you build something or start an activity that is not allowed, you may be forced to remove your improvements and could even be fined. Before we get too much further, I want to just make note that in Kansas there are often significant differences for land and buildings used for agricultural purposes inside incorporated cities and those outside of incorporated areas. Outside of incorporated cities, Kansas law generally prohibits zoning regulations for agricultural uses except in floodplains. However, to avoid any misunderstandings, if your property is in an unincorporated area, you should check with your county to verify that the agricultural use exception, that's this law that I'm talking about, actually applies to your season extension activity. So when we get into incorporated areas or cities in Kansas, that's where we're going to tend to encounter more zoning rules. In cities, zoning rules typically restrict where SEA structures may be built, as well as where agricultural activities can occur. Zoning regulations typically divide land into districts. So you may have, for example, residential districts, commercial districts, industrial districts, and agricultural districts, and then there are usually subcategories within those district classifications as well. Local municipalities usually have zoning maps available for the public to look at. Sometimes they are available in hard copy at city offices, but more and more they're also available online at the city's website. So you can use those maps to look at where your actual piece of land is located with respect to what zoning district it's in. And then once you know what type of zoning district the particular property that you want to conduct your gardening or farming operation on is located, then you will next need to determine what types of uses are allowed for that particular zoning district. And those particular uses are usually set forth in your local zoning ordinances. In addition, you will usually see whether or not those uses are allowed as a matter of right or whether or not a permit is required. If a permit is required, it's usually going to be called a special use or conditional use permit. And in cases where permits are required, there are usually review processes and some additional steps involved in getting a permit. So if you've determined that your SEA activity is allowed, you may have, be thinking that now you've got a green light to go ahead and get growing. But if you plan to build any type of structure for your SEA, then you're also going to need to make sure it conforms to design, density, and placement standards for the zoning district. So thinking back to Tom's examples, he talked about things like cultivar selection. Cultivar selection could happen inside or outside of a structure. When it's happening inside a structure, then that's when you're going to need to be thinking about these additional zoning regulations. So there are standards that can include things like setback restrictions, minimum lot size and lot coverage restrictions, placement restrictions, height limits, limitations on even the number of buildings that can be allowed in a lot, or number of accessory units. So for example, if you think back to what was the itty bitty city, I think you may recall Tom had that picture up of a garage, and then there was sort of a greenhouse behind it. Both of those would be accessory structures. They would be accessories to a residential home in most cases, and so there might be a limitation in some zoning districts that you would only be allowed to have, for example, one accessory unit or two accessory units. Other issues can be parking requirements, especially if you've got staff involved in your production. In addition, things like aesthetics and also drainage. And in some cases, where it looks like what you want to do is kind of coming up against some of these regulations, you may also be able to get a variance if you're not able to meet these structural or lot dimensions. But you should be aware that in Kansas, variances are really only allowed for those types of things. They are not allowed for uses that are not ordinarily permitted in the zoning code. So in addition to zoning, when you've got some kind of a structure or construction, then you are going to need to get generally building permits to make sure that your season extension structure is meeting applicable construction standards. So building and other construction codes often overlap with zoning codes, but they also lay out minimum standards for specific things such as building materials, electrical, wiring, plumbing, things like that, also fire codes. Again, to be sure that your SEA structure is going to satisfy any building and construction codes and other permit requirements in your jurisdiction, you're going to want to check in with your local planning office before beginning construction. So in addition to zoning regulations and local government construction standards, there are also some other potential local regulations that could affect your season extension activities. Those would include rules set by historic preservation councils, architectural review boards, and even sometimes neighborhood groups. So if you live in an area where those types of bodies exist, or if you are planning on farming or gardening in an area where those types of bodies exist, your structure or other activities may be scrutinized to ensure that they satisfy any aesthetic or other standards that are imposed by those types of bodies. Okay, nuisance claims. We're going to move out of zoning and construction code and turn to nuisance issues. So even when you've got a season extension activity that fits within the zoning and building requirements, or it's exempt from those types of requirements, they can still be problematic. And really, when we're thinking about nuisance issues, we're thinking about activities, so not so much about the structure itself, but the activities that are happening on the land, either inside or outside of a structure. So thinking about activities that might diminish the rights of others to use and enjoy their property, or that might cause harm to public health or safety. Those are types of things that can be addressed through legal claims, even if there aren't any particular laws on the books addressing those specific activities. People have the opportunity, for example, to bring their neighbors to court through a lawsuit to address nuisance claims. Additionally, cities and other communities sometimes might even bring an individual to court to address an issue like that. So just a few of the many types of examples of season extension associated activities that might come up against nuisance issues are things like hydroponic and aquaponic systems that might end up with resulting in pools of stagnant water that could attract insects or possibly create odors. You might also end up with nuisance claims around installations of large structures that might impede neighbors' access to sunlight. Another thing could be, for example, loud equipment. And where nuisance issues arise, as I had mentioned, those are usually addressed through legal court claims, but another thing to be aware of are anti-nuisance laws, for which there can just be penalties already on the books. Anti-nuisance laws would be sort of codified examples of things that the community policy officials have determined are hazardous, or sometimes just even merely annoying or unappealing. And on the screen we've got an example from one Kansas community that prohibits use of equipment in residential areas that is sufficiently disturbing in terms of things like sounds, smells, or other factors. And then another issue that we often see in terms of codified nuisance laws are issues around landscaping. A lot of times there will be regulations that control how high, for example, grass can be before it needs to be cut, things like that. The good news is that in most Kansas cities that we've surveyed, it looks like there are usually agricultural exemptions to some of these landscaping standards, but it's something to be aware of, and as you're kind of going through and looking at what the policy landscape is in your own community, something to be aware of to make sure that that isn't something that you're butting up against. Just like with zoning issues, nuisances are usually less of a concern in agricultural areas. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is due to proximity to neighbors, just because of sort of how far away they are from neighbors. You tend to have less concerns about people complaining about activities on the land. But the other thing is that there's actually statewide law in Kansas that provides that farmland is presumed to be reasonable and does not constitute a nuisance unless the activity has a substantial effect on the public health and safety. So it's usually going to be the case that if a season extension activity or structure is located on farmland, it's likely going to be considered to be reasonable. Okay, so let's just briefly look at utilities. The main thing to be aware of is water. The use of utilities is regulated, at least water, for example, by both state and local laws. At the local level, rules may affect how structures, landscaping, and things like screening are installed to ensure that they don't impede access by the fire department to hose connections on building and fire hydrants. But there's also water usage laws. Most of those are set by state standards and guidelines. As you can see on the screen, things to be aware of would include the Kansas State Water Appropriation Act, and also standards set by the Kansas State Department of Health for gray water usage. Also, just to be aware, good practice, and also it is the law, if you are going to be doing any excavating or digging, you're also going to want to call 811, call before you dig, to make sure that you're not encountering any dangerous buried utility lines. So I want to note that because every community has its own legal landscape, all of these issues that we've been talking about today are just some of those that you might encounter in your community. In addition, there are lots of other regulations, policies, programs, et cetera, that may inhibit, or promote season extension opportunities. And if you're finding that the legal and policy landscape in your community is unduly limiting season extension activities, or, for example, it's just not doing as much as it could to encourage them, take heart. There are things that you can do. Individuals, groups, and organizations can absolutely contribute to better laws and policies to support season extension activities in their communities. You can raise awareness, and you can also help to educate policymakers and planning officials. So as you work through that process, you should keep in mind that season extension technologies are always changing, practices are always changing, not only because the technology is evolving, but sometimes also because people are rediscovering old methods and incorporating them into their modern practices. One example that we have been seeing a lot of lately, just sort of starting to creep up, is the use of a structure called a wallapini. I don't know if you all have heard of this or maybe seen something similar to this, but a wallapini is going to be a structure that's usually dug into the ground. It's going to have earthen walls, and it's going to rely on geothermal heat as well as solar heat. And these structures are fantastic in that they are very cost-effective and energy efficient, but they can also run into some issues like the ones we've discussed today in terms of safety concerns, excavation issues, and also general concerns regarding community aesthetics. Emerging use of season extension activities like wallapinis are opportunities for education and community discussion. And here we are back again at this slide, and the reason is because I just really want to drive home the point that equity cannot happen when planning is done without listening to the voices of community members to understand their needs. With respect to season extension activities, this is not only going to need to involve dialogue with farmers and gardeners, but also with all community members that would benefit from increased access to better quality and more produce. So when working together with policymakers, here are a few of the types of things that community groups and interested individuals can do to encourage their policymakers and planners to support season extension activities. You can be encouraging them to review community comprehensive plans to ensure that they contemplate the benefits of season extension activities in urban areas and throughout the community. You can ask them to conduct a municipal code audit to identify barriers to season extension, and then as follow-up, develop policies to better support them. You can ask them to be evaluating utility regulations to ensure that season extension activities are being charged fairly, and also to make sure that responsible water and power usage is encouraged. And you can ask them to demonstrate the value of season extension activities in your community as part of the food infrastructure and as part of the culture of your community by establishing grant programs for commencing and maintaining season extension activities, supporting funding for community gardening equipment lending libraries, and also things like providing funding for community education programs to support season extension activities, and especially when that involves new gardeners and farmers that want to learn how to use season extension activities. So that was a lot to cover, and I know we were, again, very sort of high level with these issues, just sort of issue spotting for you and hopefully identifying some things to be thinking of and aware of in your communities as you're moving forward with your season extension activities and evaluating ways that your local policies might be better developed or changed to support season extension activities in your community. Again, I want to mention that there is going to be a forthcoming season extension activity guide specific to Kansas that we will have available on our website. And I know that my colleague, Mary Merrow, will be discussing that a little bit more at the end of today's presentation. So with that, I want to thank you for taking the time to think about these issues. I think it's fantastic that this is on your radar. And I want to now turn it over to Helen Schnoes to talk more about actual boots-on-the-ground examples of funding and partnership opportunities, as well as some examples that she has seen in Kansas communities. Helen?
Great, thank you so much, Amanda, and the rest of the presentation team. I'm going to share a bit about a community effort in Lawrence that took place in 2015 and 2016 to update our city code to become more supportive of urban agriculture. And although this process included many components related to urban agriculture beyond season extension, we did make some important updates in clarifying and actually putting some language about season extension structures into the city code. But also, as I've been learning this week, we didn't kind of go as far as we could have, and I'm actually in an emerging conversation now with some of our planning and development services staff that I'll speak to a little bit more, really digging into the details of how season extension structures function in our code as written. But a key theme that I'll be returning to during my presentation is just that education and building trust with city staff and policymakers is really helpful in normalizing and familiarizing decision makers about season extension and urban agriculture processes and practices. And really that can kind of be a big turning point in a do we allow it, don't we allow it, how do we allow it kind of conversation. And with that, we will move forward. And just as some background, key to this process that I'll be describing is the Douglas County Food Policy Council. We were formed in 2010 by our county commission and convened as a joint city-county advisory board in 2013. Some of you may be familiar with food policy councils, but just as background, this is a group of diverse stakeholders from our community across our food system, from farmers. Tom actually used to be a farmer on our food policy council, to health and policy advocates. Ashley Jones-Weisner is a current member of our Food Policy Council, to others engaged in education and sustainability and really just a wide range of issues in the food system. And this group is really key to the process that I'm going to describe. And since the Food Policy Council began convening and figuring out what it wanted to work on in Lawrence, it took an interest in how to support urban agriculture within the city of Lawrence and more generally season extension and growing the local food market. Both of these endeavors can help bring benefits to the community, which I'll speak to. What I want to say, too, is that the bottom picture you see there with the group of community members, and Tom, I actually think you're in that one as well, now I'm realizing. In 2012, through the early work of the Food Policy Council, we actually created a community garden program called Common Ground, and the URL is linked there. And this is a program that opens up city-owned vacant and underused land, including parkland, for urban food production. And it's a program that's been very successful in its 5th year. It's grown to 10 sites throughout the city and engages hundreds of residents. And as a city program, they actually have to do a public benefit. But from this kind of foundation of launching a new program, supporting it, supporting access to urban food production, there also were some issues that came up in the city on other properties speaking about urban food production, and that kind of came in front of our city commission in the summer of 2015. And for a variety of reasons, the city commission made a directive formally in one of its meetings to the planning department staff to take that scan of our city code and see how our land development policies could better support urban food production. Did we have people getting in trouble because we didn't have clear or didn't have supportive policy language? And this was quite aligned in that at the time, the Food Policy Council was actually working with some community members who had come to us as this policy advisory body and were wanting to introduce language about beekeeping. So we were already kind of on a policy change initiative and expanded it greatly with this opportunity. And I will just say, as a Kansas-focused audience, there are food policy or food and farm councils expanding throughout Kansas, and if your community has one, it could be a great venue to work on season extension policies. And if you don't have one, the Kansas Alliance for Wellness could be a great entity to help support establishing one with your elected officials and community stakeholders. So one thing I want to say that we've already heard about today is that we really anchored our discussion in this process about the community benefits that come from urban agriculture and season extension, that it brings about greater access to healthy food, opportunities to launch local food enterprises and expand market opportunities, and also builds skills and new opportunities for self-sufficiency in the community. And really to the heart of, I think, the initiative we had in Lawrence, it really speaks to the character of the community that we want to have, that we want people growing food and having community gardens to be part of our community landscape, and how to make that fit with other ideas of community character that the community has. And at the same time, as we brought in benefits that we thought should come out of this, listening closely throughout the process to concerns, experiences that others had, so we could find mutually beneficial outcomes was another key part of this. So speaking to the benefits, but also listening to people who didn't see those benefits or didn't understand what the practices were or how it could be properly integrated into a neighborhood setting was really a motivating way that we move forward through this. So what the formal policy update process was that took place in Lawrence was called a text amendment. That was the formal document the planning department worked to develop. But as you can see, it was a process that spanned many formal engagements with policymakers. What I think was the best part of this was the foresight that our planning staff had to not just make a draft, release it a week before, have policymakers vote on it, and then move on from there. I think that would have really stunted and limited the range of updates we were able to make happen in the community. Instead, they actually developed a draft and not only vetted it through the community multiple times, but vetted it through the Planning Commission twice, getting their feedback, familiarizing, educating, discussing before even asking them for a vote many months after the process started. In a similar regard, the City of Lawrence was able to hear it twice, which is somewhat more of a formality. But then we also took many months after the policy changes were made to develop communications. And I'll talk more about the value of just public communications about policies and about how folks can do it right later on. Beyond the formal work that the Planning Department did, the Food Policy Council was really able to anchor this process in an important way. We regularly invited the lead city planner in this work to our meetings, both our full council and a city subcommittee focused just on the City of Lawrence. But as we got started, we realized, well, what are people doing now? What are they experiencing? What are their barriers and wants? So we released a community survey through different community gardening and public interest groups and got over 150 responses, and that really helped inform where this draft of the text amendment and the city code changes went. From that first draft and the folks engaged with the survey, we had a public forum where we actually had 50 people come together and closely review the draft of the policy or the text amendment as it existed in September of 2015. And after an initial presentation, it wasn't just a one-way communication. We had city staff and Food Policy Council members sitting at small group tables to really dig into the details of what they've experienced, what they want to see, and what that draft code language said. And then we compiled that and continued working on the draft with the City of Lawrence Planning Department staff. But also the Food Policy Council was able to be a great idea generator in that we had members looking at other communities, looking at other existing policies, and bringing just a wealth of ideas back to our planning staff, way more than what they might have been able to compile on their own. And then all of these steps really created a dialogue that continued throughout the year-long process, in which we kept in contact with the planning department saying, this is really great, this is still going to create a barrier, this is exciting, can we edit this in this way? And that helped to ensure that the policies were expanding opportunities for food production, but not infringing on other kind of neighborhood character or community interests that might be less inclined to urban agriculture processes. And I'll say that Iowa State University has a really great overview guide of urban agriculture zoning policies, both best practices and specific examples that we really relied on. So how did season extension actually end up in our city code? These are two direct examples from our development code. The URL is included at the bottom. But you'll see that there's language in the bottom. It's the definition that we updated for what crop agriculture means. And you'll see that that bottom sentence in red speaks to standard structures that are often connected to urban agriculture, referencing hoop houses and cold frames and things as that. We also started to look at how building code could be aware of the need for season extension structures as part of crop agriculture and urban agriculture as the City of Lawrence. And so that's that building coverage statement above that when season extension structures are exempt from building code, they'll also be exempt from additional building coverage requirements for accessory structures. Now, one thing that's been kind of funny is as I was working on this, I wrote to our key planner from the update process and said, so what are the criteria that would make a season extension structure require a permit? And she wasn't sure, and so actually over the last few days I've been in an email exchange with our development services staff and our city plans examiners really digging into this detail because we hadn't quite fleshed it out before. And we're kind of figuring it out, looking at that international building code framework and seeing what it could be. But as Tom's slide showed, we do have some already existing in the city. And also I just want to report that as Amanda mentioned, all homeowners associations in Lawrence, they set their own rules outside of what the City of Lawrence rules are, and much of Western Lawrence is under a homeowners association covenant, and so these changes that we made wouldn't be reflected there, and really a homeowner who's in that sort of arrangement would have to do their own changes to the covenant itself. So as I mentioned, building trust and serving as a liaison between the public and the policymakers and the staff for this was really important to helping them become more familiar with urban agriculture and why it's a benefit and how it can make sense in Lawrence. And that time to think more about it was really key. We had planning commissioners who were kind of aghast that some of the policy changes were even being considered, being in full support of them by the time February came around several months later. And that question at the bottom of my slide, how much do you want to trust this process, that was actually a question that our Director of Planning and Development posed to the Planning Commission, because they kept hemming and hawing on, is this right? What if something happens? What if something bad happens? Should it be like this? And at one point, because we had put so much public effort, so many drafts, so much time and collaboration into reaching the draft that they finally voted upon, he's kind of said, you know, we've done a lot to get here. Do you want to just trust that this is the right place to be? And I think we wouldn't have had that sort of question posed to them if all that community engagement and collaboration had not come in advance of the process. And then, as I said, proactive communications has been really important to this too. Everyone who participated at the forum and in the survey remained updated as the drafts and as the different votes went forward. But we were also able, through the work of the Food Policy Council, to frame the story for the media. So instead of perhaps having a scare tactics, they were able to talk to the benefits of increased healthy food access and increased opportunities for urban food businesses and things like that. After the process, and really during the process, we made a commitment and a promise to the City of Lawrence Commission that with these new policy changes, it wasn't going to just be a free-for-all throughout the city. We were going to be there with the Food Policy Council working to have really proactive public communications so citizens were empowered to know not just that they can do more urban agriculture production, but that they can do it right, and they not only know their rights in what the new policy changes allow, but they know their responsibilities, again, to be good with their neighbors and have clear communications. And so if someone's interested, I really encourage you to go to the new webpage we created. The 101 image you see is actually a multi-page document we created that's a series of flow charts, and it's been really well received by the community, and I think by city officials too, because we're not leaving it to gray areas or to misunderstanding. But throughout, I guess, work in season extension and working with city policies, I think the education process and having that be a continuing process is important in that we as a Food Policy Council have done periodic tours with policymakers, just getting them on farms, getting them in urban farms, on rural farms, and really meeting people and putting a face to the practice. I think too often, if it's not grounded in your community, it might seem easy to dismiss if it's a new idea. But when you really get policymakers out of the day-to-day and on production land, they start to relate to it in a different framework. And then finally, I mean, Tom's here on the call already, but I think I want to just recognize local partners who can really be assets to community members or producers who are interested in changing city codes. Our county conservation district generally looks at larger rural farms, but there's just been a new funding stream through the National Conservation District Association for urban agriculture funding, and we've, fingers crossed, applied for that locally, but it could be an opportunity in other communities to forge a new partnership with your conservation district. Similar, the National Resource Conservation District has an EQUIP program that I'm sure Tom could speak to a lot more in depth than I, but it helps producers fund the construction of season extension. And I think on one of my earlier slides, you saw we have at least 18 season extension structures in Douglas County, and just seeing more of them further helps to normalize and familiarize folks with season extension. And finally, extension itself is a key partner both in being a resource to policymakers to ask questions of, but also then being a resource to the community to build skills and knowledge among the public. And our extension service is great here in Douglas County. And so with that, I thank you, but if you want to know anything more about our Food Policy Council or urban agriculture, in Lawrence, I'd be happy to speak to it, and just want to reaffirm that in presentations we've done about these changes, our lead planner has always maintained that a policy change is never a one-and-done deal. You always try to get better in meeting the community needs, but there's always opportunities to return to it again and make adjustments or make changes. And I think carrying forward with that perspective is really useful in lowering the stakes a bit when policymakers might be concerned about a really new code change. And so that can really just help bring it forward and support collaborative dialogue in reconciling the needs of the community with the written code as it is today. So thanks so much, and I'll look forward to questions when we get to them.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen, Amanda, and Tom. I think this is a really great overview of season extension and all of the various components of it. Before we go to questions, I just want to remind folks that there is a resource that will be coming shortly that kind of brings all of these pieces together, and we'll be sending that out to all of the participants of the webinar and anyone who has registered. So just stay tuned for that. Hopefully you'll be seeing that soon after the July 4th holiday. And also just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and so if folks, I know there were some other competing things going on today, so a number of people were interested in listening to the recording that weren't able to participate in this live. So with that, I wanted to just go to some questions, and I think we've got all of the speakers off of mute, and have a little conversation for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. I have just a handful of questions, and at the same time, please submit your questions if you have anything that comes up. So first of all, I have a question, and I think that I'm going to maybe focus this towards Helen and first, and then Amanda and Tom, you might have other things to add. But I was wondering if you have any suggestions for people in smaller rural communities for how to approach their local governments about changing any of the local ordinances, such as the zoning restrictions or other regulations that impact season extension.
Yeah, so that's what we were kind of working on with the bee issue before the whole big opportunity for the overhaul happened. And I think building your team before you go forward, so you're not a lone voice, but you're a group of people, and I mean that even beyond your food and farm council, if you have one, but who else in the community is interested, or who else in the community could be an expert. That's where extension service, if they're not part of your food and farm council, but they should be, but looking to experts who can speak to the benefits or to the realities of it, and maybe help dispel unfounded concerns, or just that education piece I spoke to. But then I think the other really helpful component to have in your bag before you go to the city officials is examples from other communities. We, as Lawrence, we tried to not perhaps look at Portland and Austin and like the real big city national kind of icons of urban agriculture. We look to Fayetteville, Arkansas, and Columbia, Missouri, and Fort Collins, Colorado. And so even for Lawrence, we were really looking at peer communities and what leadership or what examples we had from our peers that our city looks to on other topics that could make it seem not like a thing outside of the norm for Lawrence to consider. And then I think, once you have that support, I think asking for maybe a preliminary meeting with staff, so don't just show up unannounced at a city commission meeting. I think building the knowledge base and familiarity with within the planning staff or community development staff, whatever is the appropriate office in a rural community, and kind of getting them to know you and on board and able to vouch for the interest that you have, I think would be a great step. And then I think having the local commission or council direct staff to do the code review is really key, because then they're not doing it on top of everything that's part of their work plan. They're doing it as part of their work plan, and it puts some officiality around the process that I think was really essential for the success we had in Lawrence.
Great. Thanks, Helen. Tom, did you have anything to add to that about how rural communities can work with their local governments?
No, I don't really have too much to add to that. I think, you know, just knowing what you're dealing with, so being aware what the ordinances are. I know just working with farmers and interacting with farmers nationwide, there's often a lot of confusion with what, you know, if you're talking about high tunnels, what those are, or, you know, if you're doing anything else less than that. I don't know that people often get into the codes maybe until it's too late and there's someone knocking on their door with a problem. So just, I think, knowing what they're dealing with ahead of time and then, you know, following the steps that Helen said.
Great, thank you. All right, so I have a couple other questions before we sign off. I just had a question if there was any concern or legal issues that come up around structural safety issues with high tunnels, I guess specifically around snow or wind or other considerations. I know that, for example, in Minnesota, there is the state building code that has snow load requirements that can impact some high tunnel activities, and I just didn't know if there were any parallels in Kansas. Amanda, maybe we can start with you, and then Tom or Helen, if you know anything also about that.
You know, that isn't a particular issue that I have dug into with respect to the building codes in Kansas, and there are sort of a lot of different model codes that are adopted depending on the jurisdiction. I imagine because model codes are used in Kansas as in Minnesota, a lot of our codes are based on model codes as well, that probably there are similar issues, but I will make a note of that and be sure to include a bit about that in our season extension resource, which will be coming out for Kansas.
Great. Tom or Helen, do you know anything about that?
I know a lot about wind and high tunnels, less about snow, although we do have issues. So yeah, wind and high tunnels do not get along well. One of the issues that I think exists is in some places, high tunnel, and this is usually more for taxing, but somewhat for codes, is considered a temporary structure if the posts are just set in the ground rather than anchored with concrete. And that kind of varies county to county, I believe, and probably different jurisdictions also. But you know, if you just have posts stuck in the ground, the wind can rip those things out of the ground. And I have lots of pictures of high tunnels that have been damaged by wind and snow. Snow's probably, you know, less of a safety issue or maybe a legal issue in that all that's going to happen is the structure would collapse and there's usually no one in there at that time. But that does happen also. But yeah, there are definitely some requirements that could be in place, and it kind of varies place to place whether those are there in terms of how the tunnel has to be constructed.
Right.
Yeah, I don't have a specific answer, but I will say, and maybe Amanda wants to look into this too, my recent emerging conversation with our plans examiners, digging into the building code implications, they wondered if there'd be fire code components given the plastic included, and I think some of that's like he asked for an image, so I think he's coming from a very new place of orientation, but it's at least something that was interesting to me that came up in this conversation trying to clarify our city code about it.
And that's not something I've heard nationwide. I mean, the building code and structural safety is an issue that I hear about a lot. There's a high-tunnels.org is a website where a lot of growers go to share information, and so you see and hear stories of people nationwide, and building codes is something that comes up on there a lot, but I've never heard anything about fire codes, so that's a new one for me.
Yeah, and in the spirit of city staff education, after that question, I sent him to high-tunnels.org and to the Kansas Rural Center document Tom worked on, and so it's an evolving process.
Yeah.
Yeah, another issue that's kind of I've flagged around the fire codes would be placement of structures, because these are usually accessory structures. There's usually distance requirements with respect to how far they can be placed from other buildings or other accessory structures.
Great, thank you. And I think that the resource will be including some additional discussion about those things. Tom, I think this is going to be directed to you. I know that Amanda brought up the idea of wallopinis and other earthen growing structures, and I'm just curious if you see any new techniques that are emerging for different season extension activities and, you know, things that people should be on the lookout for.
Yeah, that one's definitely a newer one to me. I only know of probably about 3 people anywhere in the state of Kansas doing stuff like that, and I only hear about it if they reach a certain scale. If it's just in someone's backyard, I might not know about it. But yeah, I don't know that there's a lot of new techniques in season extension. One that I don't see being used much, and I feel like could make a bigger comeback that I think the Lawrence City Code at least has more permissive language about than high tunnels is shade structures. So you could have the same metal frame with just a shade cloth over it, and there was some research done about a decade ago that that you could grow okay lettuce in Kansas in the summer here, and so I don't see any of those out there right now, or not too many, being used for production. You know, there's a lot in commercial greenhouse, landscape horticulture stuff, them growing shade plants and things like that. But in food production, I haven't seen a lot of that, but I feel like that's kind of maybe poised for someone to pick it up because that market is kind of wide open. But that's not a terribly big variation. I don't see a lot else going on except more and more people adopting these techniques and the whole variety from low tunnels or you know, high tunnels to even just row cover. And so that's
okay, great. And then I think one other question, Tom, for you as well is, so this discussion about season extension activities has really been focused on growing produce, although right. You did talk about some of the overlap with aquaponics between growing, you know, lettuce or other vegetables using the solution and the waste of the fish. And we were just wondering if there were any other ways that season extension activities overlapped with raising animals.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. There is a whole movement of people that do mixed high tunnels or people using identical structures for animals. So it's common for a lot of pastured animals, people that do like pastured pork or things like that, to maybe have a high tunnel as a winter home for those animals. But also there's a whole group of people, and it tends to be on, in my experience around here, on a smaller scale of doing kind of mixed, so having a high tunnel that has a chicken house on one end and, you know, garden in the other half. So using a structure for sort of a mixed use is definitely something that there's some interest in. There's not a lot of it happening, but I see that that's probably an area where there will be growth. So.
Oh, that's great. All right. Well, I think that this probably wraps up our Q&A for the webinar, and I just want to thank again all the panelists for really great information and a discussion about the use of the season extension and all of the opportunities in Kansas, both to extend into winter and also to make the most of the summer season growing conditions. I wanted to provide you with the contact information for all of the speakers and encourage you to reach out and let us know if you have any questions that we might be able to answer, and also just keep your eyes out for the release of our upcoming resource. Thanks again, and hope you have a very nice day.